The desert night was merciless, its cold biting deeper than any blade, and the man who had spent years wandering its endless dunes knew how to endure it. He relied on instinct, hardened by years of solitude, his tent and fire the only constants in a world of shifting sands. When he first saw movement beyond the firelight, his hand went to the knife at his belt, expecting a predator or a thief. What emerged instead was a figure so alien that even his seasoned caution faltered. Skin the color of twilight, eyes reflecting faint starlight, braids of hair interwoven with glints of metallic thread. She stumbled forward, shivering, clutching scraps of fabric that did little to shield her from the cold. He thought at once she must be lost, perhaps from some faraway tribe, though none he knew bore such strange markings across their skin. She didn't speak much, only gestured toward the warmth of the fire, her voice quiet and rough when she asked for shelter. The man hesitated, weighing risk and mercy, remembering the code of the desert. Deny warmth to none who might freeze before dawn. He allowed her near, always keeping one eye sharp, his mistrust hidden but alive. The tent was cramped, built for one, yet he spread an extra blanket across the floor, watching as she wrapped herself with practiced haste, as if survival had been her only teacher. She said nothing more, sitting silent, the glow of the flames reflected in her gaze as though fire itself was new to her. His thoughts kept circling the odd details. Armor scraps beneath the fabric, etched in symbols he didn't recognize. Her hands trembled not only from cold but from something clenched within them, a small metallic piece she refused to release. She caught him watching once, meeting his eyes for only a second, then hiding it away. He told himself it was nothing, just some keepsake from wherever she came. He had learned not to ask questions of strangers. Questions were weights that slowed survival. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. She seemed to study his tent, his tools, his fire, every detail absorbed, as if committing it to memory. Her silence was deliberate, her presence unnervingly still, and yet she looked fragile, her body shaking under the blanket as the cold tried to consume her. He forced himself to dismiss his doubts, convincing himself she was just another wanderer caught by the desert's cruelty. People did desperate things in such conditions, and he knew too well the hunger and exhaustion that stripped away pride. Hours passed in a silence broken only by the hiss of the fire. Sleep tugged at him, though he fought it longer than usual, unsettled by having another presence in his space. When his eyes closed at last, the last image he saw was her crouched by the tent floor, her fingers brushing over the sand beneath his rug. He thought nothing of it, half dreaming, telling himself she was simply restless or searching for warmth. He rolled over, blade close at hand, and surrendered to slumber. The cold night dragged on, but within the tent, the fire kept them both alive. He had given her warmth, nothing more, and in his mind the matter was simple. Tomorrow, she would move on, and he would remain as he always had, alone with the desert. Yet as the last embers dimmed, she allowed herself the faintest smile, one he never saw, a smile that held more purpose than gratitude. For in her silence and in her stillness, she had not come only for warmth. Something had been left behind, and though he slept peacefully, believing his choice had ended with charity, the truth had already taken root in the sand beneath him. The desert gave no answers when he woke, only the endless horizon painted in pale morning light. The space beside the fire was empty, her presence erased as if it had never been, and for a moment he wondered if exhaustion had conjured her out of shifting shadows. But the unease in his gut refused to leave, and when he shifted the rugs beneath him, the sound reached his ears, low, rhythmic, unnatural. He peeled back the fabric and froze. Half buried in the sand was an object unlike anything he had ever seen, small enough to fit in both hands, smooth as river stone but alive with a faint glow. Thin lines of light pulsed across its surface, spreading in patterns that looked like veins carrying energy instead of blood. The thing hummed with a steady rhythm, a vibration that seemed to echo in his bones, too precise to be random. He reached for it, and the warmth that surged through his fingertips was so alien it made him recoil. It felt aware. He circled the device, suspicion boiling. She must have placed it here while he slept, hidden with deliberate care beneath his rugs. The betrayal stung sharper than the desert winds. She had asked only for warmth, and he had given it, but she had given something back, something he had not agreed to accept. For a long time, he considered smashing it. His knife hovered over its shell, yet the faint whisper rising from it made him falter. It wasn't words, not in any tongue he knew, but impressions, sensations, a pull, a promise, a warning. Destroying it felt as foolish as ignoring it. The animal sensed it too. His tethered mount strained at its rope, ears pinned back, eyes rolling with unease. Even the small scavengers that usually circled his camp kept their distance, the air heavy with a charge like lightning before a storm. He paced, mind racing with possibilities. Was it a marker for raiders, something that would guide them straight to his tent? Was she part of a tribe unknown to him, or something beyond tribes, something not of this desert at all? Every answer only bred more questions. That night, before he had resolved anything, she returned. She stepped into the firelight without hesitation, no longer shivering, no longer desperate. The look in her eyes carried certainty. He demanded answers, his hand close to the hilt of his blade, his voice sharp with anger. She did not flinch. Calmly, she admitted the truth. The object was not a trinket but a calling stone. She had placed it here to mark him, to send a signal across distance to those who would come. He had been chosen. Chosen for what? She did not explain in full. Her words were sparse, measured, as if too much truth might crush him. She told him only this: her people would arrive, and when they did, his role would matter. The beacon had not been left at random. It was not a trap but a bond, a declaration that he was now tied to her fate. She spoke of alliances, of survival greater than his own. He laughed bitterly at the idea. To him, survival was solitary, built on mistrust, sharpened by necessity. He accused her of deceit, of dragging him into conflicts he did not choose. Her reply was steady, almost unnervingly so. You defended me when you had no reason to. That is why the stone recognizes you. That is why you cannot cast it away. Her calmness unsettled him more than any threat could. He thought of burying the thing deep in the dunes, letting the desert swallow it. He thought of taking his blade to it, scattering its pieces to the winds. Yet when his hand touched it again, the heat surged stronger, and something inside told him such efforts would be futile. It was not merely an object. It was alive, and it had already bound itself to him. Sleep eluded him that night. He sat with the beacon glowing softly at his feet, her figure silhouetted against the fire, her eyes unblinking as if she could watch the desert itself shift. Every instinct screamed at him to cut ties and vanish, to slip into the dunes before dawn, and never look back. Yet the weight of the choice gnawed at him. He had survived countless nights by trusting his instincts, but this was different. The desert had always been harsh, but it had never whispered to him. It had never demanded he choose between isolation and something larger than himself. As the fire burned low, the beacon pulsed stronger, as though answering unseen signals. He realized that by doing nothing, he had already made a choice. Something was coming, drawn by its rhythm, and his life would never again belong only to him. The first signs came not with sound but with light. Stars that had always been constant shifted in unnatural ways, sliding across the night sky in deliberate patterns. He watched from the edge of his camp as faint streaks glimmered against the darkness, their movements too precise to be meteors, too silent to be storms. The beacon at his feet pulsed faster, its rhythm matching those wandering lights, and he knew the girl's words had not been hollow. Something was coming, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. He did what he had always done when faced with the unknown, prepared. His blades were sharpened, water stores secured, every tool laid where his hand could find it in darkness. Yet for the first time, he questioned whether survival was as simple as retreat. Fleeing might spare him from being the center of this storm, but he felt the weight of her gaze, calm and steady, as if she knew running was no longer possible. The desert was wide, but what approached was wider still. She spoke of her people that night, not in long explanations, but in fragments that painted a picture both foreign and familiar. They were wanderers, not unlike him, moving from one refuge to another, always chased by a greater force. Her clan had lost more than he could imagine, and what remained carried with it a hope so fragile it could not survive without allies. She told him the stone had marked him because he embodied what they sought, a will to endure, a spirit that refused to break even in barren lands. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the conviction in her voice left little room for doubt. When the others arrived, they did not come as raiders or conquerors, but as pilgrims. Figures emerged from the horizon, their armor glinting with patterns that echoed hers, weapons slung at their sides yet lowered in respect. They approached his tent as though stepping into sacred ground, their gestures deliberate, their movements precise. To his surprise, they bowed slightly, not to her, but to him, as though the beacon's glow had elevated him to something more than a solitary nomad. He felt none of the pride they seemed to expect, only unease at being seen as a symbol. Their leader, a tall figure with markings etched deep into his skin, spoke in a tone of reverence. Words translated through her, carrying promises of alliance and recognition. They did not ask for his land, nor his loyalty outright, but they spoke as though it was already assured, as though the stone had already bound him to their fate. He clenched his fists, resisting the role they pressed upon him. He had survived alone for years, owing nothing to anyone, and yet now strangers from the stars looked at him as if he were the keystone of their future. That night he listened more than he spoke. He learned their clan was fractured, their numbers dwindling under the relentless pursuit of an enemy who valued domination over survival. They carried with them not just weapons but stories, tales of worlds scorched, families broken, histories erased. He saw in their eyes the same hunger he had seen in the girls, a hunger not for food or warmth, but for a chance to endure. It unsettled him because he recognized it. Doubt gnawed at him. Why him, out of all the countless souls across the stars? He was no leader, no warrior beyond the simple needs of survival. He was a man of the sands, a shadow moving between dunes, and yet they looked to him with expectation. When he asked why, her answer came quiet but unwavering. Because when you had nothing to gain, you chose to act. That choice echoes louder than you realize. As their numbers grew around his camp, so did the tension. Lights multiplied in the sky, not all friendly, and whispers carried through the alien ranks. The enemy that had chased them across void and distance had felt the beacon's call as well. He realized too late that his camp was not only a refuge, but a battlefield in waiting. The desert, once his ally, might soon be painted with fire and blood. He sat beside the beacon as its pulse quickened, the vibrations running deeper through the sand, as though waking something in the bones of the earth itself. His life of solitude, built on silence and mistrust, had already been broken. He could abandon them, vanish into the dunes, but even as he considered it, the knowledge weighed heavy. Neutrality no longer existed. The desert had chosen him the moment he had let her near his fire. By dawn, the horizon glowed with movement not born of the sun. Shapes hung in the sky, vast and looming, descending with purpose. The girl stood beside him, her face serene but her hands tense against the weapons she carried. Her people looked to him with silent expectation, and for the first time in his life, he felt the burden of more than his own survival. Something vast was coming, and the choice that had once seemed so simple, trust or flee, was now bound to the fate of more than just himself. The horizon split open with fire. Shadows larger than mountains descended from the skies, carrying the weight of pursuit that had hounded her clan across countless worlds. The air trembled under the hum of their engines, and the beacon's pulse answered like a heart beating faster in fear or in readiness. He stood at the edge of the dunes, the girl at his side, her people bracing themselves for what they had run from for too long. He had never imagined his lonely camp becoming the center of a storm that stretched across stars, but the choice he had avoided now demanded an answer. The enemy came with demands, not introductions. Voices carried through distorted amplifiers, cold and merciless, offering only one concession: surrender the girl and the clan, and the rest would be left to fade quietly into the sands. The nomad listened, and though fear pressed against his chest, the weight of their arrogance burned hotter. They assumed him irrelevant, a bystander to be ignored. They had not lived the desert. They did not know how survival was carved into the marrow of every man who endured its cruelty. He chose then not with words but with action. He moved with the certainty of someone who had known all his life that the desert rewards the cunning, not the mighty. He wove through the dunes, turning the land into his ally, setting traps with nothing but rope, sand, and fire. The aliens beside him, trained in weapons beyond his comprehension, watched in disbelief as he prepared a battlefield with the simplest of tools. To them it was primitive, to him it was instinct. The girl fought beside him, no longer a fragile figure seeking warmth, but a warrior whose resolve mirrored his own. The battle struck with sudden violence. Enemy craft descended, spitting fire and light that scorched the dunes, yet the traps he had set tore into them. Sand swallowed machines, fire licked at their flanks, and the storm winds carried grit that blinded their advanced optics. He moved through chaos like he had through countless storms, striking where least expected, vanishing before reprisal. His knowledge of the land turned the desert into a weapon sharper than any blade. Amid the clash, he found himself face to face with their leader, a figure clad in armor that shimmered with authority. The enemy's disdain was clear, mocking a human who dared stand in defiance. But in that moment, the nomad understood what they could not. Survival is not measured by the strength of one's armor, but by the will to endure against the impossible. He fought not with finesse, but with ferocity, driving his blade with the weight of every night he had endured alone, every storm he had conquered. The duel ended not with elegance, but with raw determination, and the enemy fell beneath the strike of a man who had nothing but grit to offer. The tide shifted. With their leader broken and their advance blunted by desert cunning, the invaders retreated, their arrogance undone by the very environment they had underestimated. Victory came at a cost. His camp lay in ruins, the familiar markers of his solitary life shattered by fire and battle. Yet amid the wreckage stood the girl and her clan, alive because of him. They gathered around him not as strangers, but as allies, offering him a place among them, a role beyond the endless wandering of dunes. They spoke of journeys across the stars, of battles yet to come, and of survival not in solitude, but in unity. He listened, torn between the life he had always known and the unknown that now stretched before him. The desert had taught him never to trust easily, never to bind himself to others. But as he looked at the horizon, endless as always, he realized survival meant more than breathing another day. It meant choosing who to stand with, who to protect, who to fight beside when the storm came. He held the beacon in his palm, its glow no longer a threat but a promise. It had bound him without permission, but now he saw it for what it was, a symbol not of betrayal, but of purpose. He could return to his solitude, rebuild the fragments of the life he once knew, and watch the stars move without him. Or he could follow where they led, into battles not yet fought, into horizons he had never dared to imagine. The desert wind howled across the dunes, carrying no answer but his own. He did not speak it aloud, but in the stillness of his silence, the choice had already been made. The man who had once guarded only his fire and his life now stood as more than a survivor. He was a defender, not just of himself but of something greater, something worth the weight of his blade and the endurance of his soul.